Stephen Colbert, during his Wednesday night late show this week, told us that now is the time for us all to come together. To come together by staying as far apart as we possibly can. What a topic for a sermon during this time of social distancing. Physical touch. When it's suggested that we don't get too close to each other, what on earth are we doing talking about touch? Well, aside from the fact that it is the next sermon topic in this series we're doing on the 5 love languages, and it does seem counterintuitive that we'd spend time on physical touch this morning when we've been told to stay so far away from other humans, but I do think now is the perfect time for us to explore this love language, not just in the intimate terms of human touch, but in the broader context of our shared humanity. We're mammals, and we require the touch of other mammals. It's built into our wiring, and now when our personal contact is limited and we may feel cut off from one another, might be a good time to look at the physiological and psychological bases for this need for touch. We've known for years that physical touch is an effective and important way to communicate emotional love, and for some of us it is the preferred love languages. Some people may not even know their love language. Not knowing our love language or our partner's love language can lead to some interesting conflicts in our relationships. There is tons of research to support this idea that physical touch is beneficial for us. We know that children who are held, stroked, and kissed develop into more emotionally healthy adults than those who are neglected or deprived of touch for long periods of time. Physical touch is necessary for healthy human development and sustainment. There's lots of data that just shows that hugs have health benefits. Hugs lower our blood pressure. They boost our immunity. They might even help us control pain. And yet, of all of our love languages, physical touch is the one that draws the most comments and the most intense reactions from people when we're discussing the love languages. And this has to do with boundaries and whether or not we have healthy boundaries. Physical touch being, usually reserved for our most intimate relationships means that there's not that many times in our workplaces or other social settings where physical touch, other than a handshake or a simple pat on the shoulder, is appropriate. So of all of our love languages that translate outside of committed relationships and intimacy, physical touch is tricky because it requires a deeper connection than we often have in most of our day-to-day relationships. And also in this time of Me Too, it's difficult to even know what is acceptable touch. So we often just refrain from any sort of touch at all, even when someone in our sphere may be craving a hug. Okay, let's look at the basics of human touch and perhaps discover why it's so important, such an important part of our lives. Here's some facts concerning your sense of touch, perhaps the most overlooked of our senses. So every one of us is constantly receiving tactile information about the world. Every second of every day, it's just pouring into your brain. Right now, if you're sitting down, your rear end is being squished into your chair. Your fingertips are probably touching the mouse or swiping the glass on your phone. And your clothes, you can feel them on your body, your glasses on your face. All of this sensory information is pouring to your brain all at once. And in fact, the only way to make sense out of it is to tune most of it out. You probably weren't paying any attention to any of those sensations until I mentioned them. We can't turn off touch, but our brains help us filter out what's important and what's not. Touch never goes away. We can close our eyes and imagine what it's like to be blind. We can stop up our ears and imagine what it might be like to be deaf. But touch is so central and ever present in our lives, we can't imagine losing it. Then touch is also based on what we do with our bodies. It's been discovered that areas of our touch-sensing parts of our brain that we use a lot tend to expand and take over neighboring territory. A violin player who uses her left hand more than her bowing hand will have the area of her brain that processes information from her left hand expand and grow larger and take over parts of that neighboring brain tissue. Another interesting thing about our sense of touch has to do with the effects of aging. Now, it seems that we all lose our touch receptors over the course of our lives. It's not like we have them until a certain age and then they suddenly vanish. No, we lose them very, very slowly. They all peak in 16, 17, or 18 years of age, and then they start to disappear. We also lose pain and temperature receptors. As we age, we may not feel as much on the surface of our skin. And this might be one of the reasons that lead older person to take more falls. We stay upright in part because of the sensations on the bottom of our feet. And if we get less information from our feet, then we're going to have trouble keeping our balance. It's also been studied as to why touch is so mysteriously crucial for a baby's development. The best examples I found of this came from the Romanian orphanages after the fall of the Ceausescu regime. There just weren't enough people around to take care of all the babies in the orphanages. Those infants were hardly touched at all. And then they didn't just grow up to have a host of emotional problems. They were depressed. They had a high instance of schizophrenia, bipolar disease, other issues. But they also had a whole range of physical ailments. They had weakened immune systems, all kinds of skin diseases. And since then, other research has confirmed this phenomenon. We're not entirely sure why it happens, but it seems that early touch experiences are extraordinarily important for development of both our cognitive function and a healthy body. This is why nowadays, when premature infants are born and put into an incubator, they're taken out for a few hours every day and pressed against another human's skin. Initially, when incubators were first invented, people thought they should just leave the child in there all alone so they wouldn't get any infections. But you can imagine that not getting touched for the first few months of life turned out to be disastrous for some of them. Oh, and this is interesting. I think it's very important to know that touch shapes our first impressions of other people in very weird ways. Incidental touch can help inform our impressions of other people's character. In one of the most classic experiments, people were either holding a cold iced drink or a hot drink in one hand when they were meeting someone. And those with the hot drink literally rated the people that they met as warmer, as in having a more pro-social personality. They didn't rate them better overall, say as smarter or more competent. They just rated them as warmer because of a warm drink in their other hand. There was another famous study in which people evaluated each other's resumes on clipboards. They were holding the clipboards and they evaluated the resumes. If your resume was on a heavy clipboard as opposed to a lighter plastic one, the people with the heavier clipboards rated that person's resume and that person as having more gravitas, more authority. Once again, people didn't think that they were smarter or better team players or anything like that, but the weight of the clipboard processed through the rater's brains made them think that that person, the resume representative, was more authoritative. Now, when these studies first came out, no one really believed them, but they have since been very well reproduced. And it all points to this idea that has come up in social psychology again and again, and that is this. If you are evaluating someone for the first time, the first decision you make is friend or foe. Is this person warm or are they a threat? And then the second thing we do is we evaluate as to whether they are competent. And that means it kind of matters if they're a threat or not, right? So it seems that touch information helps our brains and us make these distinctions, even when it seems irrelevant. Touch is mentioned in our Christian scriptures many times, and we know that Jesus' touch healed people. That's what the Bible tells us, but upon closer inspection, some of these stories probably have more to do with the afflicted being accepted back into community. That is, when Jesus touched someone who was ill or quarantined, he was signaling to the community about him that it was okay to touch the person, that they could come back into the community. Very much how during the early years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, when we saw someone as famous as Princess Diana touching and hugging victims of that disease, we witnessed that it was okay for us to touch our friends who were afflicted. Our ignorance of the disease had blinded us to the humanity of the victims, not unlike how we were easily distracted from the humanity of others by the words and the behaviors we use to describe them. Afflicted, unclean. All of these things can work together to deprive other people of their humanity. Now, I am not saying that Jesus' touch wasn't miraculous and full of healing energy. Something happened to these humans when they were touched by this man. Something inexplicable and beautiful, and something that has given humans hope for millennia. So there's a story in our scriptures about a woman who had been shunned by her community because she had some sort of menstrual disorder. Let's hear her story found in the Gospel of Mark. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "Well, you see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." This was a bold woman then who approached Jesus in this unconventional way, secretly and without a male sponsor, a primary requirement in Jewish society at this time. But because of her condition, her impurity, she was probably cut off from the religious community and from financial stability. She may have had no choice but to act daringly. The gospel tells us she had suffered greatly under the care of medical practitioners. Attention from these professionals was usually reserved for elite persons, people of high social standing. So she must have been someone or known someone important. The suffering that we're told about remains somewhat ambiguous, but it may have been related to the length of time she had her affliction or the severity of pain, or quite possibly the social scorn of being under the care of specialists. Other women throughout history, unfortunately even unto today, have had to act in this manner with daring and boldness to retain their human dignity. Phyllis Wheatley published her poems under the scrutiny of Thomas Jefferson, Immanuel Kant, and numerous other intellectuals of the day. Jarena Lee, the first ordained female minister, pursued her God-given call to preach. Rosa Parks wouldn't give up her seat. This unnamed woman in the gospel used her voice, and her words that she used provide insight into her thinking and her theological perspective. The act of not only touching Jesus, but touching even his clothes may provide her with healing from her disease. This intricate theological rationale was then confirmed by her actual healing. And then just as the woman understood the changes in her body, her cure from the affliction, so too did Jesus recognize a change in his body. Now remember, Jesus initially played no active role in her healing. She initiated it by her surreptitious touch. The drying up of her blood flow was due to this release of Jesus' power. And no one else, including all of the disciples present, recognized what had transpired. Not even Jesus was fully aware of what had happened, but he was unwilling to allow this outflowing of his power to occur without acknowledgement. The stealing of a healing miracle was inappropriate. It was one thing for him to touch others, but another matter altogether for someone to touch him. So in her next set of actions, it was probably fear, not boldness, that provoked her to come forward and admit what she had done. She stopped, she presented herself to Jesus to reveal the whole truth. She didn't have to return. She could have escaped the crowd with her healing intact. But she apparently understood Jesus' intense look. So the Greek word that is used here is a very common word used in the Gospel of Mark, and it's usually reserved for Jesus' glare. And she may have recognized the potential for public shame if she were caught by this male healer. She stood there in the presence of his glare, and the cultural weight of this situation probably demanded her to return, to fess up to her actions. Oh, and imagine how many people in that crowd must have blanched after hearing her truth, that this unclean, bleeding woman had come into contact with so many of them before her healing. Makes us wonder how many have already been exposed to COVID-19 and don't know it. And after his initial glare at the crowd and his surroundings, Jesus' reaction then was rather surprising. What flowed from him, his power, earlier had healed the woman. And now, what was flowing from her, her truth, would bring forth Jesus' healing, confirming words, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." And there is your deep theological task for today. Think on this story and what it might mean for our current situation. The desire for a cure at all costs, and the realization that miracles can and do occur. For my scientific brain, this is one of those places where it comes into great conflict with my theological one. Your faith has made you well. During times of crisis, we hug each other, we crave that touch, the reassurance that another human being is there for us. In a time of crisis, we need to feel that we are loved. And what better way to feel this than a great big hug? So now, in this time of social distancing and quarantine, we need to understand this basic human need to be touched in a new light. Our very human bodies crave and require the touch of another, and our souls need it even more. Let this be a time of creativity for us, a time to examine old ways of thinking. Look at our physical bodies in a new way. Let us ask questions of ourselves. In the past, did I shy away from touch? Did I abruptly end the hug with a loved one? Did I avoid situations where I might be touched? Look at those questions in your life and then use this time of forced separation to dream. To dream of the day coming soon where we will all gather again in this room and engage in one gigantic celebratory embrace. Dream of the days of embrace to come, because they are coming and they will be joyful. Of this I have faith. Amen.